So we spent the last 3 modules talking about trauma, what are the behaviors that come from trauma, and why environment is so important in caring for children, and how even we get into this crazy cycle with kids. So what is the starting point? We have all this information now, so how do we start with that to begin to help repair the relationship, to help that child find healing, to create more stability in the home? And that starting point actually comes from the caregiver. And it comes from the caregiver's ability to be able to stay calm in the face of a huge explosive episode, in the face of frustration from behaviors. I like to think of it like we all have this internal thermostat. And the hotter our internal thermostat goes, the more into our survival system we're going. Rule of thumb is that in a family system, really in any system, whether it's a family, a classroom, whatever it may be, the person whose thermostat sets the hottest, everyone else in the home will adjust to. And that's with the exception of one intentional adult who can stay cool. When one intentional adult can keep their thermostat cool, then the other children in the home will begin to adjust theirs. They'll begin to lower as well. That caregiver really sets the temperature for the rest of the home. How do we do this though? How can we stay calm when there's a child constantly raging, or there's a child who may be shut down, and no matter how hard you try, they just continue to shut down? How can we stay regulated when every time you say something, a child says, no, you don't, no, it's not, because all of those things can become very, very frustrating as caregivers. I think the very first step is being able to recognize in your body when your thermostat is going up. So if you are raising a child, if you're caregiving for a child who after everything you say says, no, you don't, no, it's not, just notice what goes on in your body if you find yourself getting irritated and frustrated. We tend to think of our survival system, because it happens so quickly, is instantaneously I am okay and then now I'm not. And I'm yelling and I'm screaming and I'm communicating through all these behaviors that I don't want to be using. While this is true that it happens within milliseconds, our body actually gives us warning signs to let us know that we are starting to go into our hot system. So take a minute and just think about, when you feel upset, what are things that you notice in your body? And I would even encourage you to write them down. What is that very first thing that you notice happen in your body when you're starting to feel upset? Some people may say, my heart starts beating. I've heard people say they feel this heat rise up through their face. I've heard some people say they clench their fists, they clench their jaw, they bite their lip. They feel this tension in their chest. But what we can start with is that very first point of, what's that very first thing that happens? Does your heart start beating really hard? And then what happens after that? Do you start clenching your fists? And then what happens after that? Does your face become hot and flushed? Do you become red? Do you start sweating in your palms? In that first step where we're just beginning to recognize what's going on in the body, that's not the time to learn how to stop it. We just want to recognize what's going on. If we try to stop it before we understand what's going on, we won't know the correct areas in our body to try and relax. But once you have a good grasp on what areas of your body are being affected, from there you can begin to relax those regions of your body. So let's say that you are a fist clencher. And when that child says, no, you don't, and you feel your fist tighten, you can begin to relax that part of your body just by shaking it out. Remember, you can't be in the social engagement system at the same time that you are in the threat response system. So if you feel your passive system or your aggressive system coming online, that social engagement system is going offline. It's no longer working. And if that system's no longer working, at that point, as a parent, you cannot be effective for your child. And 2 survival brains does not equal a thinking brain. 2 survival brains often equals an explosive atomic bomb. So we want to start relaxing those areas as you recognize what happened. I told you at the very beginning that I ended up in trauma work just on a fluke. What happened was I was in my master's program for marriage and family therapy, and I needed one last class to graduate, but they weren't offering that class for like 8 months. And so they said, hey, you can take this trauma class, and it will meet the requirements that you need to graduate. So I took this trauma class just because I was impatient and didn't feel like waiting. And in that, I first of all fell in love with trauma, but I began to learn about this process of cooling our bodies. And up until that point, no one had really told me in my life, hey, you're able to cool your body down, you're able to cool your system down when you're going into your survival system. And at the end of that class, the instructor challenged all of us. He said, for the next year, I want you to begin to recognize where you feel your survival response coming on in your body and work on cooling that down before you respond to your family members. And look at how it changes your relationships. Look at how it changes how you interact with your children, with your relatives, with your spouses. And so I did that for a year, and it really changed things enormously. And it was a lot of work, and I talk about recognizing these things in your body, and I talk about relaxing those areas. And it would be easy to turn off this video and say, I'm ready for this, I'm going to do great. But it actually takes a lot of time. So that was 4 years ago now, and I'm still learning how to do that. I'm still learning how to calm those areas, how to become aware of it. And right when I think I have it figured out, I notice, oh, there's that area that gets tense. Maybe it's my shoulders. Maybe it's a tenseness in my chest, and I have to try and figure out how to relax those areas. I wanted to walk through with you, though, some just easy skills that help with calming our body down. When we take deep breathing, when we take a big, deep, a true deep breath, a diaphragmic breath, so that's a breath that comes from our diaphragm, that causes our sympathetic nervous system, our aggressive system, to lower and to go lower. And as that goes lower, what we call our parasympathetic nervous system comes online. That's the system where we slow down. That's the system where we can be in this social engagement system. So the first thing I'm going to have you do is we're just going to start with deep breathing. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you put one hand on your chest, and I'm going to have you put your other hand on your belly. And as you do that, I want you to take a big, deep breath, but as you take that deep breath, I want you to fill up your belly, and the hand on your chest should move very little, if at all. And then breathe it out. Do that a couple times, and once you've practiced moving your belly in and out with a deep breath, I want you to count to 5 as you breathe in. And 5 as you breathe out. If your breath is full, if you're filled up before you get to 5, that means that you're breathing too fast and you need to slow it down. If you go 3, 4, 5, that breath is going in way too fast. We want it to be nice and slow. And as you become more and more skilled at taking that deep diaphragmic breath, you can even increase the time to 6, 7, 8, and even 9, 10 seconds to where you're slowing that breath down, because the slower we can get it, the more calmer of a state that we'll be in. The other thing that we can do is, it's called sifting. Again, it's from the work of Dan Siegel. It is our sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. Sift. So as you start feeling that system, that survival system come online, just stop and notice what sensations you're feeling in your body. Are you feeling tension in your shoulders? Are you feeling clenching in your fists? Are you feeling the sensation of your heart pounding throughout your whole body? And as you pay attention to those sensations, what images come to mind? Are there images of the immediate? Are there images of the past? Are there images of concerns in the future? And you don't want to reject any image that comes to mind, just accept it as it is. And notice as you think of these images, what feelings come up for you. Is it a feeling of anger? Is it a feeling of frustration, of sadness? And what thoughts come from those feelings? And again, there's no right or wrong thought. It is just a thought, and just accept it as that. And what that allows us to do is to become aware of what's going on for us, to become more reflective of what's happening for us. And it causes us to have to pause before we respond. And it, again, brings the whole system to a calmer state. Another thing that we can do, and this is something that you can teach your child as well, is what's called hand breathing. This is really great for kids, but again, as adults, we can use it as well. So you start with your finger at the bottom of your hand, and you breathe up slowly. And then you breathe down and up and down. And you do that through your entire hand. If your lungs are full before you get to the top, that means you're breathing in too fast. One other one that we can go over today is a calm place. So if you're comfortable with it, and if you're sitting down, go ahead and sit in your seat with your feet flat on the ground. Get yourself in an upright position, but not rigid, but just upright. Close your eyes and imagine a place where you feel calm. Imagine a place where you feel just the stress melt away from anything that's happening. You may find that you're with people. You may find that you're alone. And take a big deep breath in and try and make it that slow belly breath. And breathe it out. And just notice the calm feelings that you feel there. And take another big deep breath in. Breathe it out. And when you're ready, open your eyes. When we feel ourselves going into those heightened responses, we are going to serve a child a way to handle that. And we can either validate our child's negative belief, or we can be supportive and empower them and teach them better ways to have those needs met. If we serve them an inappropriate response, what we're teaching them is to return that back to us eventually. And so when we're feeling upset and frustrated by what a child is doing, they're going to eventually return that back to us, those upset feelings, that inability to pause before responding. When people are in that survival state, when they're in that survival mode, they're not in that thinking part of their brain, that learning part of their brain. Problem solving is turned off. And so if you try to verbally teach a child how to respond when they're feeling upset, they're not in a place where they're going to learn that. One of the best teachers, though, for people who are in that survival system is by modeling. So if you're feeling upset and you say, I need a minute, I'm upset, I need to take a few deep breaths, and you stand there and you model it for that child, then what you're saying is it's okay to pause and respond, and it's okay to take a breather. And you don't ever actually have to say what you're doing. I remember there was this instant with my son. I told you at the very beginning, I'm very goofy. I have very little shame. There was this instant with my son that we had adopted, and I could see literally he was going into this rigid thinking, and his arms got stiff, and he was going into his rigid mind, and I felt myself going into that rigid place too, where had I just reacted, I probably would have yelled, and I probably would have told him he just needed to not act that way. But in an effort, as I felt my arms get stiff, I thought, I need to loosen out. And so I made it a game for us where I grabbed his arms and I just started singing this song. It totally came out on the fly, and it went, wiggle like a noodle and shake yourself loose, wiggle like a noodle and shake your caboose. And so by the end of it, we're wiggling around, we're shaking around, and neither of us was in that rigid place. And I didn't ever have to say to him, you need to relax your arms. You're going into this rigid place. But what I did was I modeled for him how to loosen the body back up. And even in some instances, being able to take those deep breaths for children. We had another instance in our home where we had a child raging. And one of the best ways to take a deep diaphragmatic breath is by putting your hands on your head and pushing your elbows back as far as you can and just breathing. So I had this child in her home and she's raging and I can feel myself, my thermostat's going up, and I said, I'm getting really angry right now and I just need to breathe for a second. So I put my hands on my head, I push my elbows back as far as I can, and I just sat there for about a minute or so and I just sat there and breathed. And all the while, she stops the rage and she's looking at me like, what is this lady doing? What I was doing was teaching her it's okay to take a minute to pause before responding. The calming techniques that I gave you are just a few. There's hundreds of them out there. There are apps on your phone for mindfulness, for being able to slow the body down. One of your extra resources is a video on mindfulness and the importance of mindfulness. And so I encourage you to start looking up, whether it's an app, whether it's a video on YouTube, ways to engage in mindfulness to be able to begin to cool your own system down. And when we're able to begin to cool that system down, then we are in a place to begin to build an attachment with children. So from an attachment with children is how they're able to cool themselves down. Just on an interesting side note is that children literally don't have the ability to calm themselves down when they're feeling upset on their own until they're around 11, 12, maybe 13 years old. That means up until that point, developmentally, a child will need the care of a supportive, or the help of a supportive caregiver to help calm them down when they're mad. I have been in this spot before, but I can't help but almost giggle to myself when I am in the grocery store and I see a parent who has a 2-year-old who's throwing a fit saying, you need to stop this right now. Because what's happening there? One, they're serving to the child the exact behavior they're trying to stop. They're throwing the equivalent of an adult fit. And two, that child can't stop without the help of someone saying, hey, sweetie, what color eyes did I wear today? Did I wear my pink eyes or my blue eyes? And that child will look up and be like this. And then you can say, can you take some big, deep breaths with me? Breathe in, breathe out. Smell the flowers, blow out the candles. And it's through that the child is able to regulate. But that child needs a caregiver that is calm in order to do that. Because when we're in our space where we're not calm, we're not in a place to attach to a child. So let's spend a minute just talking about attachment. Attachment is really the measure of a relationship. Attachment is not something that a child is innately born with. That attachment is how we measure the relationship. So some things that happen through attachment is it forms the basis for relating to others, for interpersonal functions. So through attachment, the body is able to regulate. It also helps with the coordination of the body. Through attachment, there's emotional regulation, there's emotional balance. It teaches kids pausing before responding. It helps them to understand empathy. It gives them insight and judgment and moral awareness, so understanding right from wrong. Also, it helps a child to form their identity. What's interesting is a lot of those things that we mentioned, insight, understanding right from wrong, empathy, pausing before responding. If you remember from previous modules, those are all things that we've talked about as being part of our thoughtful brain, part of that part of our brain that does not turn off. So in essence, we're helping to develop those, what we call executive functions. We're helping to develop that neocortex through attachment. There is a critical period in attachment that in which attachment is formed. However, a secure attachment can be damaged at any time. If a child loses a parent to death, it can damage that secure attachment. An important thing to recognize is attachment, which will make sense especially in light of what we learned about resiliency, is that attachment serves as a buffer for trauma. So when a child has that safe, secure attachment, then that child is much more likely to be okay. It buffers those big events that happened. Attachment serves as that security. A secure attachment says to that child, you have a safe base to come back to. When you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling big feelings, you have that safe place to come back to. It is not a characteristic of a child. Again, it's a measure of that relationship. When there are persistent problems in a relationship, though, that's where we begin to see an insecure relationship. That's when we begin to see some of the behavioral problems. That's that child's way of communicating, excuse me, I'm not feeling safe and I'm not feeling secure in relationships. So there's four types of attachment. There's actually two categories. There's insecure, which has 3 subcategories, and then there are secure attachments. Secure attachments are when the child knows they have a safe base. Attachment equals security. When it equals security and safety. So when a child is securely attached, they know that they can trust the world and they know that they can trust the people in the world to help look after them. So there was a woman, Mary Ainsworth, and she did a study, and this is how we came up with secure and insecure attachment. And in this study, it's called The Strange Situation. What she would do is she would have a mother come into a room with an infant, usually around a year, maybe a little bit older. And she would have the mother sit in the room with the infant. A stranger would come in. The mother would leave the room. Then the mother would come back in the room, and they'd do this a couple times. And they were looking at the child's response to that stranger. So for children that had a secure attachment, when the mother came in and sat down with the room, the child usually stayed pretty close to mom and then eventually started wandering off in the environment, and but would look back to mom, would make sure that mom was there. And when the stranger walked into the room, that child would look back up to mom. And what that was showing is that the child knew that that mom was there, that the child felt safe with that mom. There was security and safety in that attachment. With children that didn't have a secure attachment, they had an insecure attachment. In the Strange Situation study, they found 2 types of insecure attachment. The first one was an avoidant attachment. So what would happen is when the mother brought the child into this situation, the child just went off and didn't even acknowledge mom anymore after that. The stranger would come and the child continued just not to acknowledge mom. The child never looked back for comfort from mom. I'm going to go back for a second. In the secure attachment, when mom left the room, the child cried, and when mom came back, the child was able to be easily consoled. So with our avoidant attachment, when mom left the room, the child didn't even acknowledge that mom left. And when mom came back in the room, the child didn't even acknowledge that mom came back. The child was avoidant. Where we see this the most is where parents that are largely absent from caring for a child's emotional needs. We see a lot of this with parents who are depressed and are not able to be attentive to the child's needs. if we were to actually take the heart rate of that child, even though they looked calm, their heart rate would be skyrocketing because they would feel so much panic by the situation and not having a safe base to go back to. Our second type of insecure attachment would be a resistant or ambivalent attachment. This would be a child who, when mom came in the room, would cry and wouldn't be consolable. And when mom left the room, the child would just cry almost to the point of making themselves sick. And when mom came back, the child would push away from mom and wouldn't accept her nurturance. It wouldn't accept her being able to soothe that child. And what we found in this was for parents who highly interfered with the child. So parents who, it was marked by two things primarily. Parents who interfered with that child in an overwhelming sense. So that child, they were constantly not allowing that child to have free play, but they would really step over that child's needs and desires to input what the parent wanted to do. They also really frequently picked up and handled the child and wasn't allowing them to be more exploratory. But the other thing that marked it was inconsistency. Sometimes the mom was available and sometimes she wasn't in the caregiving system. And so really what that left that child was, I don't know when you're going to be here or not. So you can try and console me, but I'm still really sad because I don't know if you're going to be here tomorrow to console me. So that was our second type of insecure attachment. The third one, which came later on, is what we call a disorganized attachment. This is when the caregiver, the very person who's supposed to be safe for a child, is the one that's harming the child. So for this child, it is, they can't organize their experience because on the one hand, their body's saying, I need you because you're supposed to be safe to me, but I can't have you because you hurt me. I can't come to you with safety because you hurt me. And so we find children who have a really hard time organizing their world, organizing their life experience because they don't have a parent as that compass point of safety. So when children come into our care, oftentimes they have the disorganized type of attachment. They don't know how to organize themselves to the world. They don't have that compass point. And the grown-ups in their life who are supposed to be the ones caring for them are the very ones that are harming them. So in attachment, there's this emotional attunement. It's this dance that we do of, I can read your body language, you can read my body language, and as a child grows more and more, they'll be able to read that child or the parent's body language, but I can attune to you. And through that attunement, through that connection, there's flexibility in thinking. There are neural patterns that start spreading in a hierarchy through the brain. Our brain works from a bottom-up approach. And so we start making that bottom-up approach and being able to use some of those higher functionings. Also, we have this thing which speaks to attunement as well. They're called mirror neurons, and they work mostly in the context of our social brain. And our mirror neurons are what help to build empathy. We found the mirror neurons through, there's the study done, and I may be a little bit off about this, but you'll get the overall point. They were taking brain scans of monkeys. So they had these monkeys hooked up to these things measuring what's going on in their brain activity. And just kind of on a fluke, one of the monkeys was sitting there eating peanuts. And when they looked at the brain scan of that other monkey, the second monkey, the same exact regions were lighting up for that monkey as he watched the other one eat peanuts. And so that caused those researchers to say, what's going on here? So basically what happens is we have a part of our brain that mirrors the brain of somebody else. So when someone walks into their room and they look really sad and really down, then we sometimes will start to feel sad and down ourselves. Our brain is going to begin to mirror their own experience. And it's through that we are able to have empathy for one another and to have understanding for one another. And through connection and through attachment, those mirror neurons are able to develop. When children are in environments that leave that absent and they're not able to build that empathy, it can be very frustrating for foster parents. It can be really frustrating for the caregiving system because there's this expectation of this relationship is going to be reciprocal. But if that child isn't able to have empathy, which many of them lack empathy, they oftentimes aren't able to return some of those processes. Also, so through attachment, we're able to help build those mirror neurons. Well, also, through attachment is the parent's ability to help the child regulate their feelings and help them to learn self-regulation. Dan Siegel, again, coined in his book, Mindsight, he talks about understanding what is going on in another person's mind. So when there's that secure attachment, we can have an understanding of what's happening for another person and what may be going on in their mind. Sunderland wrote, "Joy is the result of human connection. With high levels of bodily arousal, optimal levels of epinephrine rushing through the body, optimal levels of dopamine and opioids cascading over the brain, we feel intensely alive, wide awake, and with tons of energy to do what we want to do." So through connection is where we secrete, we gush all of these wonderful chemicals, and we feel alive, and we feel energized, and we feel so good. I saw this cartoon the other day, and it was by Pat Brady, his comic strip, Rose is Rose. And the first image of this cartoon strip was a child, and they had their shoulders slouched, and their face looks kind of gray, and above it says, depleted. And the second one is of this parent holding the arms wide open, and above it says, charger, okay? The third one is of the child sitting in the parent's lap, and the parent hugging the child, and above the head it says charging, right? We have the depleted device, the parent is the charger, and when they are connecting, when they're attaching, then it's recharging that child. It's releasing all of those really feel-good chemicals that are giving that child energy again, which are giving them joy again. The third part of that, or the fourth strip of that, was the fully charged wiggles, where the child's wiggling all around. And finally, the child is fully charged and running with tons of joy and energy. And so as caregivers, that's what we are. We're our kids' charger. That's what happens through attachment, and when we connect with them is we recharge them. When behaviorally they're acting out and they're lying, stealing, and manipulating, those are definitely not the behaviors that cause us to want to be the charger, but we're still the charger for them. So some of the things that happen, some of the things as foster parents that we can do to build attachment is, first and foremost, we have to stay regulated, and we have to be able to manage our own affect, our own ability to express emotion. Because oftentimes these kiddos come into our homes with zero window of tolerance. So when we come at them with the furrowed eyebrows and the pointing finger, what their brain is saying, their smoke detector goes off and says, threat, threat, threat. Remember, it can't tell the difference between an emotional threat or a physical threat. It just says that there's a threat. And so we have to be able to stay regulated. We have to be able to keep our own affect managed for them. The second thing is being excellent at attuning to the child. Just like us, we have all these little cues to tell us when we're going into survival mode. So does our child. And if you watch very closely and if you start to attune to them, they're going to start sending signals. I fostered long enough to know that you can watch a child as they progress through the week, and you can see certain things build when they're about to rage. Generally, a rage doesn't happen on this isolated island when suddenly you're in this rage, but there's this build of things, and how can you intervene before you get to that point? How can you tune enough to the child to say, there's something going on internally for this child's world? The third thing is we want to provide consistency and predictability in our actions. We want to have a routine, but again, We don't want to have a routine at the expense of a relationship. The relationship will always come first. But we want to have a routine. We want to be consistent. If you make a promise, it's important that you hold to your word in that. And we want their day to have some semblance of predictability where they can know what's going to come next. And if there's a day that's going to be different than the other days, how can we prepare the child for that? So even with that, creating routines and rituals that create safety. What's your waking up routine? Is it the same every day? Is there a ritual? What's your going to bed routine? Some families will read stories, some families sing songs, some families say prayers, but can you keep that routine consistent? Can it become this ritual that you do at night? Are you a family that the parent lays with the child for a little bit to give them that connection time? But being able to create those routines for that family. And then learn to recognize and be responsible for your own emotions. Again, I know I said this multiple times, but our children that we're caring for don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to make my caregiver's life horrible today. So oftentimes we feel that way and we place blame on the child that somehow they're causing our lives to be miserable. But learning to recognize when we have our own negative beliefs coming into play and being responsible for those emotions rather than placing blame for our emotions on the child. And then this is huge, is continuing to develop one's purpose and identity. How can we continue to build what our purpose is in what we're doing? And last but not least, finding a support. I've talked to so many caregivers who really don't have any support at all. And I truly believe that we were meant to raise our kids in a village, and we've lost that so much today. We have really lost that. And so there are times when we're going to be overwhelmed. There are times when we're going to feel like we're just depleted and done ourselves. And who can we go to step in? Who are those additional role models and supports that we can have to step in for us when we feel depleted? So just some interventions that you can do to help create that attachment and to create that connection with a child. One thing is to massage their arms and their feet and their legs with lotion. I know one question that's raised a lot is for kids that are sexually abused, and is it okay to rub their hands and arms with lotion if they've been sexually abused? For children that have been sexually abused, we want to teach them that touch is okay and that there's appropriate touch. And we want to teach them that that there's nothing wrong with their body. When we don't touch them at all, we're really confirming for them, you are an object and you are damaged. However, we also want to be respectful of those boundaries. So maybe we just rub with the hands. Maybe we give the side hug for them. But a piece of that is for any child, whether they've been sexually abused or not, is attuning to them enough to know if they're comfortable with the lotion. A lot of kids have sensory disorders, and that doesn't feel good on their skin. That feels really yucky. It feels very unnerving for them. Some kiddos aren't comfortable with the physical contact because they have so many attachment needs. They have such an insecure attachment. And so we really want to be paying attention to those cues, and we want to get them there eventually, but we want to go at their pace, not where we think they should be. Try not to forget to integrate the senses. We get so caught up in the mundane and the going in and out of every day that we forget to have fun with them. Dance, sing, clap, have a dance party at home, play with bubbles. All of those things are important for attachment and for development. When a child makes that sucking motion, that signals to the brain for attachment. So do something fun with them where you're chewing bubble gum together and you have that same motion, the sucking motion or the chewing motion, because that's going to signal for the brain it's time to attach. So have a bubble gum blowing contest with them. Eat crunchy chips and see how loud you can get your chips to crunch. But all of those things are so vital to development that we want to be integrating that stuff all the time. Make eye contact with them. Eye contact should never be used for anger, and it should never be forced. We don't ever want to come at a child with the angry eyes and the pointing finger and yelling, because that's such a vulnerable place for pretty much everybody, but particularly kids that have been traumatized. And then engage them just in developmental activities. And the reason I say developmental activities is because I like to think of it like a child has 3 ages. They have their chronological age, which is the number that they have tied to them. They have their developmental age, which once they're in school, we tend to think of it as where they are at developmentally in school. But they also have their social and emotional age. So you may have a 15-year-old chronologically who is functioning at a 2nd grade level, but socially and emotionally is at 5 years old. And so we want to, as much as possible, engage him or her in those activities at a 5-year-old level, because we want to meet a child developmentally where they're at. So if we have a 15-year-old who is or socially and emotionally a 5-year-old, we need to meet those 5-year-old needs. Developmentally, children have what is called a developmental responsibility. There are responsibilities that the brain must go through in order to continue to build developmentally. It's like building blocks that stack one on the other to form a solid development. So for instance, crawling. Crawling is a developmental responsibility. In fact, there are studies that show that if a child walks too early before they've had an opportunity to crawl, that later in life they may have more coordination problems because their brain did not get that developmental responsibility. And so thinking back to children that we're caring for, how many of those developmental responsibilities did they miss? Did somebody ever play peekaboo with them? Because that's a really important developmental responsibility. Did anyone ever play hide and seek with them, or the hot and cold game where you hide something? Did anyone ever blow bubbles with them? All of those things are things that we just do naturally as caregivers that are vital to our child's development. So for this last module, it's what every foster parent, I think, anticipates and look forward to is let's talk behavior. I think one of the hardest parts of what foster parents do is trying to figure out and manage and balance behaviors. How do we draw rules and structures for children and yet at the same time meet the unmet need? So when we talk about behavior, that is of the utmost importance is how do we meet the unmet need? If behavior is communication, what is going on? What's causing them to try and communicate behaviorally? And how can we teach them a better way? And how can we meet the need? So in addition to this section, there are multiple resources and videos that you'll be watching, and those videos will address specific behaviors. One of the difficult parts about doing a webinar or a big training is that I know oftentimes people have questions of specific behaviors. My child is doing this. And I think sometimes what we're looking for is this magic wand approach. If the trainer just gives me this X, Y, and Z and I do it and the behavior will go away, or if you just tell me this magic formula that's going to make everything better. With behaviors, though, it takes a lot of time and patience. It takes understanding specifically that child and what their needs are and how to meet those needs for them. And every child is going to be different. And so we can give you some tools to put in your toolbox, but what behavior boils down to is how do you meet that unmet need? Dr. Bob Rhoton once said, behavior isn't learned from instruction, it's learned through the canvas of relationship. And so if we teach our children, if we want to teach them more effective ways to communicate what those needs are, that's going to come through the canvas of the relationship that we engage them in. So let's first start by talking about some of the things that we see commonly in therapy with parents who are raising foster or adoptive children. It's very common for parents that are raising foster and adoptive children to engage in overly harsh or overly punitive discipline. The child may do something very small, and yet it's ending in this explosion of anger from the foster parent, or it's ending up in an unleveled response. So the child is getting in trouble. They're getting grounded for a month from something, from a privilege or from a tablet, because of something very, very small that the child is doing. And when this is occurring, we need to take that step back and say, am I becoming rigid in my thinking because I'm experiencing that continuous type of trauma? Because my own circuits are blowing out, that I'm no longer able to think flexibly about this? Am I no longer able to take responsibility for my own actions and for my own emotions, and now is falling on that of the child, and I'm viewing them as the problem? I'm scapegoating them for all the problems. The other common thing that we see in therapy with foster parents is a failure to respond to a child's needs consistently. So at some points there's love and warmth, and other points there's withdrawal, or there's this overly harsh punishment. Sometimes we're able to meet those needs, and sometimes we fail to meet them. Foster parents also have been known to have inconsistent or rigid limit setting. They're causing very, very rigid limits. At one point, I used to train the PS MAP classes for foster parents, and I was co-training with another facilitator, and she brought in this list of rules that a foster parent she knew had made, and it was the rules for their home, and it was literally 5 pages of single-spaced rules for the home. Could you imagine, I think for an adult, if we went into a job where our boss says, here's all the rules, how anxiety-provoking and how rigid that would feel to us. Now imagine for a child who doesn't developmentally have the ability to understand, and developmentally may not have the ability to follow all of that rules. And then we begin to set that child up for feeling as though they have failed, and really giving them no semblance of success in their life. There's also this inability to express affection with ease. There's just this tension that occurs in the relationship. And I do want to recognize that when we foster, it's kind of like this. I need to protect myself, so I'm going to keep you at a distance, because as foster parents, we don't have any rights. We don't have a right to what happens in that child's life. Sometimes we can have a say, but we really don't have any right to that. And it's hard to give your heart to a child that we know may not be with us forever. Or we might do one of these because we have our own attachment needs, because we came from an environment that wasn't supportive of us, because we may have a low level of tolerance for other people's affection. And so we might really struggle with expressing that affection for children. And when we do, we find our body becoming tight and tense. With that, there's an inability to enjoy the interactions on a consistent basis. So we find it hard to just laugh and play. The lotion time feels uneasy. The singing, the bubblegum blowing, all of those things mentioned in the last module just don't feel like they're coming naturally and flowing naturally. We also can minimize other people's painful experiences. So if that child cries out for their biological parents, we almost have this pull yourself up by the bootstraps approach to it, and we're not allowing them to feel. We're not allowing them to grieve that. When they rage and when they feel shame for raging, we largely what we see is there's this unacknowledgement of what's going on for them. When they cry, we go to the stop it and don't do that, and we're not really allowing children to express all of those experiences. These children are grieving, and they have so much stuff emotionally going on for them, and they feel that through their whole body, and yet we stifle that. Another thing that's very commonly seen in therapy is that their kids act, or the parental figure, the caregiver, the foster parent, acts angry when the child struggles to self-soothe. So if that child isn't able to cool their thermostat on their own, they're met with anger. They're not met with compassion. They're not met with someone saying, hey, let me help you take some deep breaths. Come over here and cuddle up with me, and you can cry for a while if you need to. What's interesting about that is all of those ways that the child's saying, I'm trying to communicate to you, what we're saying is, you're not allowed to communicate to me the very things you need to tell me to get those needs met. Because what that child needs is connection. They need those unmet needs met, so they're communicating it to us, and we're saying, we're not going to meet those needs until you're able to stop expressing to me that you have needs, okay? And then we also see the caregiver behaving aggressively towards the child when the child makes efforts to connect. The child is shut down, the caregiver will become hostile and aggressive towards the child. So there are a lot of struggles. Again, that could be from past trauma of the foster parent. That could come from just being traumatized through raising children. But those are the things that we see consistently, and unfortunately, those are the very things that will prohibit that child from healing, that will prohibit that child from learning new skills that they're able to express and voice their needs rather than acting them out. So I like to think of it like we have this, it's almost like these glasses that we put on, almost like sunglasses, and it's how we see the world. So if we come from an environment 1, we're going to see the world in a very dismissive way. We're going to see the world as though we're isolated. If we come from environment 5, we're going to see the world as being performance and everyone needs to perform. So our kiddos come in with these templates, with these glasses on, primarily based off of their survival system. On a cognitive level, it seems illogical. The nature of it is that they're thinking through this behavior, or that they should be thinking through this behavior, but those goggles, this template, overrules logic. So logic would say, if you're feeling sad, go get a hug from your mom. But if they're wearing that template, if they're wearing those goggles that say, I'm not safe, that's going to override what logic would say for them. So what does it mean? That means that behaviors become very durable and are difficult to change. When they come in with the way that they view the world, with the way that they see the situation, and it has become an effective way, it's become a helpful way for them to survive, it's going to be very difficult for them to change. The other thing is, even going into treatment, most treatment assumes that children are in their social system, but this actually isn't the case. Kids come into treatment in their survival system. So I want to just go over quickly again what some of those templates are, some of the ways that kids will view the world. It could be, I'm not safe. It could be, people aren't safe. People will hurt me if given a chance. The world is dangerous. No one's here to help me. Everyone wants something from me or will take advantage of me. I'm not as good as so-and-so. I'm weak, I'm flawed, I'm broken, I'm damaged. I will never get better. Everyone is judging me. So when they come in with that template, when they come in with the way that they view the world, those fears will arise that will trigger them into their threat response system. So this is formed based off of fears of being powerless, fears of change, fears of being blamed or vulnerable. And those fears then, as they walk around with this template, really will trigger them into that threat response system. So our very first starting point is understanding what is their template. What is that negative belief system? What is it that they have built behaviorally through those lenses that are causing that behavior? And knowing that that behavior is going to be durable. It's not going to be quick to change. When we consider discipline, our must-haves are relationship. You cannot change behavior until you have the relationship. I want you to think for a moment, have you ever had a boss that you just despised, was just a terrible boss? You didn't enjoy going to work. You didn't enjoy being around them. When you worked for that boss, what was that work experience like? Some of the things that I've heard is that there wasn't really a lot of motivation to do a really good job. Sometimes it was just about the job, but there was no enjoyment. And there are so many other things. Sometimes it felt like walking on eggshells or being on edge while at work all the time. Now compare that for a minute to a boss that you've had that you really enjoyed. They really seemed to care about you. They took interest in your work. They congratulated you on a job well done or acknowledged you when you worked really hard on something. And it was through that good boss that likely people feel more motivated to do a good job. They feel more motivated to try harder and to give it their best. So in their home environment, it's very similar. When kids have that relationship with their caregiver that says, I'm going to encourage you when you have an accomplishment. I'm going to acknowledge you at a job well done. I'm going to be supportive of you when you struggle. Then that child is going to have more of a foundation to build on. They're going to feel more comfortable and more at ease in being able to express themselves and being able to be corrected in behavior. But much like the bad boss, if it's just about performance, they don't care about how we're doing and they always criticize everything we do, there's not a foundation for us to feel motivated to try harder. There's not that foundation for us to feel comfortable and safe. We just end up walking around on eggshells, and so it's true for kids. It's like they end up just walking around afraid of failure, and some of them are just like, I don't even care. There's nothing I can do, right? There's absolutely nothing I can do to please my caregiver, so what does it even matter anyways? So relationship. And then we also want to make sure there's structure and safety. There are some behaviors that if a child's engaging in that behavior, the very first thing we want to do is make sure that they're safe. Safety is always number one. So if that child is at risk for harming themselves, if that child is at risk for running, we want to do what we can to get that child to a safe situation. So there are, this is by the work of Bruce Perry and his neurosequential model. It's the 3 R's to addressing children. Remember that our brain starts from the bottom and works up. So that very bottom system is our regulation system. After that becomes our ability to relate to others, and then our reasoning system. So when a child is engaging in a behavior, we want to work our way through these 3 R's. The first R is, number 1, we want to regulate them. If a child is raging, that's not the time to sit and try and reason with them. That's not the time to go into cause and effect. Remember our hand model of the brain, all of that cause and effect, all of that reasoning is shut off. They're not hearing you, and even if they do hear you, they're not in a place to reason through it. So first we want to get that child regulated. We're going to talk a little bit about, in just a minute, about ways to help that child, to help children to regulate. Once we have a child regulated, and I mean really regulated, because sometimes kids will do this, I'm okay. Well, chances are they probably need a little bit more time for their system to calm down. Once they are regulated enough, at that point we want to relate to them. We want to sit down and validate the feeling. Oh, I know you're upset. I know that this was disappointing. I bet you felt really angry about what happened. We want to relate to them. That helps them to feel heard, and it helps them to feel understood. And then at that point, if they're regulated and we've related to them, then we can reason with them. That's when we can actually go into teaching them a better way. We can give them skills to use other ice cubes so that they're not using some of the ice cubes that they've used in the past to soothe that sunburn. So when we think of discipline, we want to think of what fires together, wires together. We mentioned that in an earlier module when we watched the neural pathways connect. So when a child is misbehaving, it's like standing in front of that field of grass And if we sit there and lecture them, it's not going to create a neurological firing. In fact, rule of thumb is a child will hear 1 word per year of age they are. So if they're 2, they're going to hear about 2 words and their brain's onto something else. If they're 10, they're going to hear about 10 words and their brain's onto something else. If they're a teenager, they probably won't hear anything at all. Really, if they're a teenager, they're probably going to hear about 2 to 3 sentences, and then their brain's onto something else. So we want to engage them in, we want to be able to teach them in a way that's going to cause neurological firings, and that's done through action. That's done through walking alongside them rather than just lecturing them or yelling at them. Keep in mind, though, with that small changes can cause a meltdown, especially if you have a child coming right off of a heightened dysregulation. If you have a child coming off of a meltdown, small changes can cause them to go right back into that meltdown. Kiddos also have very little tolerance for disappointment, and traditional discipline or punishment can lead to a meltdown. For kids that have been traumatized, traditional methods of discipline and punishment are highly, highly ineffective. And then firm and harsh words will often trigger a child back into survival brain. And so what happens is we get dysregulated, we get frustrated, we come at them with harshness, and all the while we're causing that child to go farther and farther into their survival system because their little brains are saying threat, threat, threat. And so either they'll shut down or become more aggressive. So the way that we are going to work with kids is first we want to connect with them, empower them, and then correct them by giving them a voice. Again, that's from the work of Karen Purvis. The way that we are going to connect with them is through proximity. We want to get close to them. We're going to give them words to use. We're going to help them to use their words instead of their behavior. We want to use touch, and we want to use a gentle affect. We connect with children by having a 2-way conversation. Again, if we go straight into the lecture, then they're not going to be listening. But if we can ask the question and say, tell me what's going on. Tell me what you're doing. And we really want to start engaging them. I would recommend that you don't use the word why, because why implies judgment. So when we use the word why, it's kind of like, why did you wear that today? Well, when we ask someone that, then automatically they're going to feel guilt or shame about what they're wearing because that word implies judgment. So avoid the word why, but help me to understand what's going on here. And start having the conversation. Another great way to connect is by asking a comparative question. A comparative question is going to cause that child to draw back up into their survival, or not into their survival brain, into their thinking brain. So when you ask a child a comparative question, this is what you see. You say to the child, I'm noticing that today you're having a little bit more of a rough time than you were yesterday. Can you help me understand the difference? And generally, this is what kids will do. And when you see their eyes start moving around and going up into the corners, that means that they're thinking. So now we've got them back up into their thinking, which is where we want them to be. We also want to come to them with open hands. When we have our closed hands like this and our body tight, this says, I'm closed and I'm not open to you. For younger children, if we can squat down and open up our hands. For older children, if we can come with a more flexible and open body stance that says, I'm ready to connect with you. I'm ready to help you succeed. That's why I'm here. And then again, we want to have the warm face and an affirming smile when possible. That's not to say that you don't ever want to use a firm look, but there's a difference between a firm look saying, I'm serious and I care about you, versus an angry look which says, you need to be frightened of me. So let's talk about just some basic connecting versus disconnecting strategies. A time out is really where we say to a child, I can't handle this right now. You need to leave the room. You need to go away. And what the messages we send to children is, I only want you around me when you can act the way that I think you should act. Or I reject you unless you meet my expectation. What a time in says is that I'm going to come join you. I want to see you succeed. And let's sit down, let's take a breather together, and let's see if we can figure out a solution. So a time in says we're going to spend time in together. The time out often sends a message of I love you conditionally or I reject you, okay? Resolution versus consequence are other connecting versus disconnecting strategy. A resolution says, let's figure out if we can work this problem out. A consequence says you were bad and you're going to get punished for this. With a resolution, even for older children, you can begin to help them engage in what the resolution for the situation should be. Several years ago, we had a child in our home that got suspended from school. And rightfully so. I do not feel that the school was inappropriate in that suspension because what she did was a pretty big thing. So part of the resolution that we came up with was during that suspension for her to write letters to apologize to the people that her actions impacted. That was in hopes that she would begin to think about how her actions impact other people. We did not take a punitive approach. We didn't go straight to the consequence of you're going to have to sit up in your room all day for doing this, but how can we find a resolution to the problem? Your actions caused other people to have hurt feelings or cause fear in other people. And we can resolve that. We can problem solve in that relationship. Which leads to the next. Are we lecturing or are we problem solving? A lecture is just a wall of words. Oftentimes, lectures are more for the grown-ups than they are for the kids. It's when we get to this point of I feel so overwhelmed that I just have to let it out, because lectures are so ineffective for kids. But problem solving says let's sit down together and talk about this and let's see if we can solve this problem. We've got a child in their thinking brain. We've got them engaged in their upper functions. Again, they can't be in their survival brain when they're thinking through these things. I'm going to back up with that though. If a child is not regulated, that's not the time to work in problem solving. We have to regulate, relate, and then we can reason with them. And this one is just worth mentioning that because it can become so draining, and as caregivers, we can become so depleted ourselves that sometimes we lose sight of a child's preciousness. And so one of the greatest ways that we can connect with them is to focus on their preciousness and instead of focusing on the failures. Even if it's the littlest thing that they're doing, being able to praise them. If it was the first time that they've ever really truly apologized to someone, recognize that in them, and just focus on no matter what they do, there's no such thing as bad kids. All kids are good. And kids sometimes make more poor choices, just like grown-ups do. When we use connecting strategies, we correct behavior, there's contentment in the relationship, and there's a deepened connection in the relationship. When we use disconnecting strategies, we might stop the behavior, but there isn't contentment and there definitely isn't a deepening in relationship. And remember, it's through that relationship that children are going to be able to regulate themselves. They're going to be able to calm themselves back down. They'll be able to be in that social engagement system. So Karen Purvis talks about ideal, the ideal approach to behaviors. And each letter stands for what that caregiver should do when a behavior needs to be approached. The first one is make it as immediate as possible. If a child is engaging in a misbehavior, we don't want to wait till the next week to address it. We want to make that as immediate as possible. The second thing is we want to be in direct proximity and we want to have eye contact. So if a child is about to hit another child from across the room, we don't want to start yelling, "You need to stop, that's not okay." But what we want to do is we want to walk over there as quickly as possible, and we want to come between that physical aggression. And we want to create gentle eye contact with that child, using attunement, being able to tell if that child can at that time tolerate that eye contact. The E is for efficient and measured response. So we don't want to, if a child spills milk, they don't need to be grounded for a month for that. Again, that's one of the things that we see it commonly in therapy is a child will spill milk and the foster parent won't let the child have milk for 2 more weeks because they've spilled milk. Really, when a child spills milk, it just needs to be cleaned up. If a child is looking at pornography on a tablet, that's a much bigger behavior that we want to take a look at. And so if they get grounded or if they get their tablet removed from them for a while, that might be something to consider because there's a safety concern there. We want to make sure that kids are not viewing those things because they're very harmful in development. So we want to make sure that we're efficient in our consequence to misbehavior, to behavior. The third thing that, or not the third thing, the A in that is action-based. As much as possible, we want to engage the child in action. It's like standing at that grass field. If we just sit and talk to them about it, we're not creating new neurological pathways. But if we can get them to take action in some way, then they will be creating new neurological pathways. Even talking about it can be helpful because it will draw that child back up into their survival system, or not out of their survival system, into their thinking brain. But action, when they can actually walk through and take action in it, is where we're going to create stronger neurological pathways. And I'm going to give you in just a few minutes some tools for creating more action-based correction. And then finally, the L is to level it at the behavior and not the child. Again, all kids are good, and so we don't want to say you are a bad boy, you are a bad girl, you are bad for doing this. What we want to say is, let me help you a better way. This isn't the best choice, so let's try and figure out a better way. You're still good. I'm here to help you succeed. I want to help you succeed. Let's figure out how we can help you to succeed. So let's talk about action-based. One of the things that we can do to correct a behavior and make it more action-based is what I call a redo. It's where we actually have the child redo a situation again. We're not going to sit and talk about options, while that is something we can do, but we really want them to engage in redoing the situation. So again, we want to make sure the child's regulated, we want to validate, we want to relate to them, and then we're going to say, hey, let's try this again. So if a child began to rage because they were told they weren't allowed to do something, once they are regulated and you validated them and you've reconnected with them, then we're going to take them back through and we're going to offer them words that they can give back to us. But we're going to walk through the whole situation again. So maybe you're standing in the kitchen and before the child said, I want to have a chocolate bar and it's 5 minutes till dinner time, and you say, you know, how about we have the chocolate bar for dessert? And now they're raging and they rage. Well, it's 30 minutes later, everybody's calmed down, you guys have reconnected, you're attuned to the child, you know that child's now in their social engagement system, and you can say, you know what, I want to see you succeed, so let's try this again. I want to walk back into the kitchen and I'm going to say to you, hey, let's save that candy bar for after dinner. And this time I want you to tell me that you're feeling upset. How can you give me words that I can understand so that I know that you're feeling upset by this? And sometimes kids might need help coming up with those words, so you might give them some words to help them out with, but have them return back. And when they say those words and when they walk through that situation, we're now creating neurological firings that are going to create wirings. The other thing that you can do is for really big behaviors that are persistent is externalize the behavior, make it outside of the child, and practice that behavior before it happens. So one of the ones that we used when we had children that would rage, we would talk about the rage monster, and we would say stuff like, you know, that sneaky rage monster, he makes you do things that I know you don't want to do. I know that you love our family. I know that you would never want to hurt us, but that rage monster, when he sneaks in, man, he sure can be sneaky. So let's practice defeating the rage monster, because when he comes, he is going to make you want to kick and scream and hurt people. But if you defeated him, then you can do stuff like kick and scream and yell at the pillow. And so then you can take the child actually into a safe place, maybe it's into a bedroom, maybe it's in the living room, and practice kicking and screaming and hitting the pillow. But make it a fun thing where you're deepening that connection, where you're connecting with the child, where you guys are having fun together. And that oftentimes will deflate the purpose of the rage. The specifically for rages, which it could be a lot of behaviors, kids have learned if I'm going to be connected, if I'm going to get my connection needs met, I'm going to have them met through the negative. So they learn if I rage, people are going to give me connection. If I lie, people will spend extra time with me. If I manipulate, I'll get my connection needs met. If I tantrum, I'll get my connection needs met. And when we engage in that with them, we are validating this is how you get your connection needs met. We want to meet those connection needs before it gets to that point. So that child has a connection need. When we practice the rage monster, we're meeting that connection need in a positive way. I had a child one time who, she was kicking the wall in our house. And I actually was going to go talk pretty harshly to her and say, you need to stop, you're going to kick a hole in the wall. But I paused myself and I actually thought, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? The very worst thing that's going to happen is she's going to kick a hole through the wall and we'll fix it. We've fixed holes before. So I just went up to her and I said, I can see you're feeling upset. I'm going to go sit on the couch when you're ready. Why don't you come over and sit next to me and we can talk? I never said anything about kicking the wall. And so I went and sat on the couch, and she stopped literally maybe 2 minutes later and came up and curled up on the couch next to me. And at that point I can say, okay, can you give me some words that I can understand? Because when you kick the wall, I'm not sure what you need, but when you talk to me, I can help you. I can help you to succeed then. One thing that we can use as well that's more action-based, and I think that we forget this a lot of times, is that we can use humor to defeat tension. Again, we want to be appropriate with it. We don't want to use sarcastic humor. We don't want to use shaming humor. And we don't want to use humor when a child is already in a meltdown because they're not in a place to understand that humor. But if you're attuning to that child and you're noticing that maybe they're starting to feel tense, maybe they're starting to go down this road where they are becoming more and more dysregulated, you can use humor to defeat that tension. So one night we were sitting at the table and everybody at the table was just fighting. And one of those moments where I wanted to just go in and be like, everybody just stop. But I didn't. I took a couple deep breaths because I reminded myself this isn't going to accomplish anything and it's probably just going to make it worse. And so I threw my arm up in the air and I started rubbing my armpit. And in the meantime, all the kids paused and they look at me and I said, I started using this new deodorant and my armpits are so soft now. And all of my kids look at me like I'm the craziest person in the world. And then they just started laughing. And the rest of the night, we probably just talked about inappropriate body humor, about armpits and inappropriate body functions that maybe a lot of families won't talk about at the dinner table, but it diffused that tension. And so we're able to use humor instead of going to the punitive. We're able to curve that and say, let's not yell, but let's find a different way. I never had to use anything punitive to stop all the fighting. We've talked a little bit about this, but remember to model the self-regulation as well. Again, that can be action-based, where we're not lecturing, we're not using a wall of words, we're not going into know-it-all-itis with our kids where we have to be the know-it-all. Again, when we go into know-it-all-itis, usually that indicates that we're the ones that are feeling dysregulated as well. It indicates that we are going into that rigid thinking. But when we model that regulation, it's more of an action-based approach. So as we go into discipline, we have to make sure that we're mindful of what's happening within our own thermostat. We spent a whole module talking about how to stay calm. And when we become upset, we are highly ineffective for our children. So some things to remember, that when children have gone through trauma, they're seeing threats in their environment, they're seeing perceived threats that others don't see. And so what seems to us like just bad behavior that came out of nowhere has a point and a purpose for that child. So what are they trying to communicate? What's the negative belief, and how can we meet that need for them? Their brains are trained to be on guard. Many of the children that come into our homes have that SWAT team. They are trained to be on guard, and they are trained to take down anybody who tries to come to them, even if well-intentioned. Another big one, again, it comes back to that myth of once a child's in my home, everything's going to be okay, is that it can take up to between 30 and 90 days per year of age that a child is, if the parent is consistent, for them to build trust. So if you have a consistent parent who is meeting that child's needs, if that child is 10 years old, it's going to take 300 to 900 days for them to have that built trust in that relationship. So we're talking anywhere from a year to 2.5 years. So this doesn't happen overnight. Again, imagine a child that's beginning to learn walking. How many steps do they have to take before that walking becomes natural? It takes thousands and thousands of efforts of that child learning to walk for them to feel safe in their balance, for them to trust that walking process. So much is part of that development of that child, and that in building that trusting relationship. Our kids aren't out to personally harm us. What they're doing is trying to communicate to us. And are we going to be receptive to that language? Are we going to learn what that language is? If you bring a foreign speaker into your home, are you going to try and learn what they're trying to say to you? Or are you going to say, don't talk to me until you've learned English. Don't even come to me until you've learned English. So for kids, they're coming to us with this communication of behavior, and we need to learn that communication. We need to learn that language that they're speaking so that we can provide for them what they need. They're not coming at us saying, I don't love you, I want to make your life hell today. They're coming at us saying, please come help me, and this is the only way I know how to say that. And that their behaviors really are based off of those negative beliefs. It's just a product of that negative belief system. And so we need to make sure that we're staying regulated for it. If you find that your child is continuing to trigger some large emotions in you, you may even want to consider seeking counseling for yourself to figure out what is going on that you aren't able to find a way to regulate around them, okay? What are those unmet needs that need to be met for yourself, and having someone help you to explore that. Remember to have fun with your child. In all of the behaviors, it becomes easy to say, this just isn't fun, this is all work. But find times to intentionally have fun, but also have the expectation that they might not engage in the funness. It might be overwhelming for them. Make sure that you plan accordingly so that you can prepare them if you go out and do something with them. But have fun at home. Play board games, dance, blow bubbles, have bubblegum eating contests. Another fun one for kids that do okay with sugar, you can also use other small snacky foods like even dried fruit, is take 3 small pieces and have them close their eyes and put a piece in their mouth and have them chew it up and guess what kind of food they're eating, what kind of candy they're eating, or what kind of dried fruit they're eating. And finally, read, study, and practice. Along with this training are a lot of resources. Make sure that you look up those resources. Reach out to people that you know if you're having trouble understanding how to handle a behavior. Reach out for counseling if support is needed for yourself or for the child. One last thing that I wanted to mention in regard to behavior is what I call scripting. It's important for consistency for children for us to have a scripting process of words that we use so that they know what we're trying to communicate to them. And this would be a short phrase that we use each time with a behavior. What you might find is that you even have some of your own scripting as a parent yourself. So one scripting that I have heard parents say before when kids talk disrespectfully is in a very kind way saying, "Excuse me, can we try that again?" And a child will learn that when a parent says that, that means, I want you to try that again. That wasn't an appropriate way to talk. What we do at the same time is we're engaging a child in a redo, okay? I have had parents who have said to kids, "Are we going to go down this road today?" And that signals to the child, "I want to support you, but I need you to take a minute and pause on what this action is going to be." I've had parents who have the scripting, "I want to help you succeed. Tell me how I can help you succeed." And with the scripting, there are these phrases that we use over and over and over again that just become a very common part of our language, so that child has that consistency in knowing and understanding what we're trying to say. So as we close out this session, I wanted to give an analogy from Gabor Mate. And in fact, he has this analogy, but I added to the end of it specifically for parents caring, foster parents caring for kids in child welfare. So the metaphor goes like this. If you were growing a plant and that plant wasn't growing, would you look at that plant and would you say, "You're lazy, you're manipulative, you're just trying to get my attention. You're trying to manipulate me because you are just engaging in this attention-seeking behaviors"? We wouldn't say that to our plant. What are some of the things that we would look for if a plant's not thriving, if its leaves are wilting and it's not growing? We would look at the soil. Is the soil proper? Is it getting the nutrients it needs in the soil? Is it getting enough sunlight or too much sunlight? Am I watering it enough? Is this plant getting too much water? All of the factors that we're going to look for in this plant have to do with the environment. Again, we're not going to say to that plant, "You're so lazy." So much is true for our children. When children in our homes are not thriving, we have to say what's off about the environment, because when the appropriate environment is provided, then the child will thrive. When kids come in with a lot of trauma behaviors, they'll begin to thrive. So we'll begin to see a lessening of those behaviors. We'll begin to see a lessening of those symptoms of the trauma. What I would add to that, though, is for kids in care, not only are we going to look at the environment, but we have kids whose roots are in shock. When a plant's roots are in shock, it's going to take time for it to stabilize. The plant is not going to be growing these huge, lush leaves all of the sudden. It's going to take time for that plant to stabilize. And what the environment needs to provide is extra tending, loving care to that tree. We need to pay extra attention because its roots are in shock. And so for our kids who have been uprooted and moved, whether it's from their biological family to us or from home to home to home, their roots are in shock, and so they need extra compassion. They need extra empathy. They need extra connection so that we can care for those roots that are in shock. If we don't care for them, then likely we will begin to see that tree start to wither. What I would even further go on to say is that sometimes we have a tropical plant in a desert environment. Let's say that our home is a desert environment. And in a desert environment, we grow desert plants, saguaros, palo verdes, beautifully. But now we have a tropical kid in our home. We can grow tropical plants in the desert, but we're not going to look at that plant and say, "You know what? You have to be a desert plant now. You're just going to have to figure out how to thrive in this desert environment. Sorry." Or we're not going to look at them and say, "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you growing in this desert environment?" What we're going to say is, how can we help this tropical plant to thrive in this desert environment? What do we need to do to change a piece of this environment to adjust to this plant. What does this plant need? Does it need more water? Does it need less sunlight? Does it need cooler temperatures? Do we need to place it in a specific way? And once we're able to do that, at that point we'll start seeing that tropical plant thrive. So in addition to this training, please make sure that you check out the additional resources. Some of the resources will talk about specific behaviors and how to work with those specific behaviors.